Hi everyone, welcome. I'm about to feed a couple of my worm bins here. I've got an assortment of fruits set aside for them as well as a couple other things. But before I remove this plastic covering, I wanted to point out these couple worms over here. I can't tell if they're beneath the plastic or inside the plastic bag. But if they're inside the plastic bag, I think it would make good sense to fish them out of there before they end up stuck and can't get out, and it does appear like that's the case. I think the reason is that the edge of the bag sort of ended up in a spot where it was easy enough for the worms to make their way over into the bag. However, I don't know. I don't know how good they are at tracking back and getting out of a situation. Sometimes it seems like they're not so good at that. So I think I'm going to rescue these little guys, get them out of the plastic bag. And I think when it comes time to restore this covering, we'll try to do so in a way that the opening is a little more difficult for the worms to enter, preferably preventing them from doing so. There's a good number of castings stuck to this plastic bag. I hope I got them all. I don't know. It seems like when they're in the plastic bag, they're kind of protected from drying out, so they might not have been in extreme danger. But it just seems to me like if they were to spend a great deal of time in there and never find their way out, who knows, maybe they'll starve or something could happen to them. So this bin is, oops, all right, looks like we got a couple worms that ended up on the rim of the container here. They must have been on the plastic bag as I was shaking it loose of the castings. I can see a couple worms hanging out on the top of this piece of paper here as well. A little tiny one stuck to the bottom too. Alrighty. Perhaps evicting the worms from this piece of paper is not so important. But it did seem important to get rid of them off of the, or out of that plastic bag. So now, what we have here in the middle, you can see it's a circular object. I'm curious to see how it's holding up to the onslaught of the worms. So yeah, it's not just covered in castings, it's actually got big holes in it. So we're just seeing right through what remains of it. This is a coffee filter, and I've got a few days worth of coffee filters set aside with which I was planning to feed today, and I guess we'll save one of them here as the replacement feeding zone indicator. Yeah, that was indicating to us where we last fed, right down here in the middle. And that last feeding was 13 days ago, feeding number 11. So today they're going to get feeding number 12. From what I remember, the feeding consisted of some fruits, a variety of different fruits. And the one semi-novel item that I included in the last feeding was a combination. No, that's not even a combination. It's bird seed. So, I mean, it is a combination of different types of bird seeds or different types of seeds. There's some sunflower seed in there and a number of little other types of seeds. Because normally I would, take that bird seed and pulverize it, but it would just become one of multiple ingredients in my worm chow mix. But I just decided that I would pulverize it and keep it separate from my worm chow mix, or ingredients that I plan to use in my next worm chow batch, and just go ahead and feed it to the worms over time, gradually doing away with it. So this was actually the first system that received any of this stuff, and this jar was almost full, and I've already managed to do away with about half of it. So maybe by the time we get back to feeding these guys next time, we'll be almost done using that stuff up. I've been using it on almost all of my feedings. This is a stem of a pumpkin, in case you didn't recognize it. It's the sort of thing that's going to take quite some time in the worm bin. And then some of these other larger tough objects that we keep bumping into. That's this a corn cob. And this is another corn cob, but one that's been sort of split down the middle. That would probably aid in its breakdown over time. And now I think we might be running into what might be leftovers from the last feeding. This is the rind of some cantaloupe melon So that's the rind of cantaloupe melon sometimes sticks around for a while, so I can't remember if it was one of the things they received as part of the feeding last time or if it's still leftovers from a feeding that came prior. And the rest of the stuff we're bumping into down here appears to be just a pile of newspaper. That's cool. We could use this stuff as sort of the foundation for the feeding. Nice little pile of recycled bedding. And I'll see if I can sort of unfold some of this. Some of this seems like it's kind of crumbled together and folded on top of itself. So much so that it looks like it's receiving pretty much no worm traffic. If we sort of spread it out and open it all up, it would probably stand a better chance at getting consumed. So now here we're bumping into a nice, pretty heavily worked banana peel. See some of the fibrous remnants of it here. It's really thin and really flimsy. There's a lot of worms hanging out on it. This would be the outside, the more shiny side. So they've really done a number on that. I believe that was one of the things that they got fed last time, 13 days ago. This part of the banana peel is the stem. That usually takes a little while longer. It's got some nice juiciness to it usually, and that's the reason the worms seem to like crawling around inside of it, nibbling out the juicy portions that are a little bit soft. And then those more fibrous components of it eventually go too. Those take a little bit longer for the worms to nibble through, but it all goes in time. So the stuff that they're getting today is kind of more of the same. Whole bunch of banana peels here, and I've also got a big bag of grapes. So since we've got 2 bins to feed, I'm going to give this system half of what's been allocated for today's feeding. I believe this piece of carrot might also be part of the last feeding. If it's not, then it was part of the previous feeding. So with 13 days between now and the last feeding, and I believe there was an interval of maybe 12 days between the last feeding and the feeding that came prior. So if that's true, then 25 days for a piece of carrot seems quite a long time. I always got the impression that carrots are the sort of thing that goes pretty quick, but in my worm bin, the carrots the worms usually get is just carrot peels, not whole carrots. But in this particular case, there were some baby carrots that just had to go. Just weren't really fit for human consumption any longer. So they got reclassified as worm food and went into the worm bins. So I just don't have that much experience providing the worms with whole chunks of carrot, usually just the peels. And the peels are pretty easy for the worms to break through and eat, especially if it's, prepared the way I prepare it, which is, well, nothing fancy in terms of how I prepare it. It's just frozen. But just the freezing and thawing process seems to aid a lot in the breakdown of the foods that the worms get. So, I don't know. I'm just always kind of curious to see what kind of leftovers remain. So I've spent a good deal of time sort of just probing through here and exploring what remains of the leftovers, sort of checking it all out. But I think we've gotten to the point where we should probably just press on with applying today's feeding. So let's make sure we open up a decent sized hole here. I just keep running into another banana stem. This one feels pretty intact, so this one was probably one of the ones they got last time as well. And it is usually a pretty good chance that you're going to find a worm squirming around inside of it. 1 or 2 of them. Lucky ones that make their way into there. And it is a little bit surprising to see how juicy the inside of a banana stem is. More cantaloupe rind. Alright, let's press on with getting these little guys fed. Okay. I don't know, all those chunks of newspaper, seems like putting in big chunks of newspaper whole is pretty much going to guarantee that it's going to go nowhere fast. In my supply of leaves, oddly, I spent the entire day outside collecting leaves in my yard. Probably something I should have done a while ago. But it was a nice enough day, and I still had some leaves that I still needed to collect up. So So I spent a good deal of time doing that, but the one thing I did not do was replenish my supply of leaves that I usually have on hand down here. My leaf supply box is empty. But I do have my prepared bedding, so you know what? Let's grab them a handful of that and lay that down as a little bit of a foundation beneath the feeding. If I remember correctly, I've not yet even tapped into this since I replenished it. Yep, that's true. So you can see here, this is the more seasoned side, this is the more recently replenished side. And usually I put this stuff away pretty moist and damp, but this portion seems like it's a little bit drier than usual. I know that the last portion that I had prepared was really damp, and this stuff seems to be kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum. That's fine. I'm not going to worry too much about it, even though there's a whole bunch of leftover, you know, bedding type materials. All these scraps of paper that we encountered on the way are still in here. These are African night crawlers, and I would assume that they're going to appreciate getting more bedding to nibble on. Although since they are African night crawlers, and since we're about to enter winter, I think we're only about a week away from the start of winter now. Perhaps it's because of that the worms seem to be slowing down a little bit. These worms usually seem most active in the warmer temperatures, but since my basement, where my wormery is down here, isn't heated, I mean, you can hear the heat just kicked on. It's right in the next room down here in the basement. The heat goes upstairs, doesn't come down here. I've got a vent actually right above me here, and if I elected to do so, I could certainly open that vent, allow heat to come down into here, but I choose not to. It's really not that necessary, I don't think. Look at the size of this banana. The thing was huge. In fact, I just ate one of these big, huge bananas right before I came down here. After an entire day working out in the yard, I still haven't eaten anything, so that banana was my first little snack. And once I'm done here feeding the wormies, I get to feed myself, so I'm looking forward to that. So I've still got the peel of an entire other banana over there. So I figured let's hang on to that last scrap of the second one, and then we will have given both systems about a peel and a half. So you can see there's the yellow as well as the red grapes in here, and I figured let's see what we could do about splitting this stuff up evenly. This stuff was contributed by my mom. I got it from her a few days ago when I was over there to visit. I guess she just let this stuff sit around in her refrigerator a bit too long. Or I don't even know if she refrigerated it or not, but you know, whatever. She had this stuff sitting around for a little bit too long, and she decided it just didn't seem fresh. Maybe they're kind of drying out and getting a little crinkly or dry, or whatever the case may be. Some of them do look like yeah, I remember her mentioning something about how they were starting to turn into raisins. They were just getting so dry already. So I think we've held on to about an equal portion to give to the other system. So let's see what we could do about giving them a little bit of this stuff over here too. This pulverized birdseed. I'd really like to do away with this stuff. No real reason. I just think it's it seems to me like a really good food to give the worms. So I feel like let's give it to them. Let's keep feeding with it. There's a lot of nice castings in this system. 125-day-old system today. This is feeding number 12. Yeah, these worms have really been plowing through their environment, turning everything into castings. Probably a good thing that we gave them a nice healthy portion of bedding underneath the feeding too, because out here all I see is castings. Luckily the moisture content of this material is really nice. Even though it's really kind of loose and flaky and crumbly, it's certainly not dry. It's got a good moisture content for sure. Sometimes I worry about the outer edges, but you saw how thoroughly that plastic covering went edge to edge all the way around the top of the system, protecting it from evaporation. With the type of heat that I've got in my house, as you heard before, it's forced hot air. You heard the blower spinning over there, making a bunch of noise. And it does seem to me like the forced hot air type of heat tends to really dry the air in the house. I remember where I grew up, there was the type of heat, the baseboard heat, which just has like hot water pumped through these little radiators down at the floor. And those things are simply kicking off warmth, you know. Whereas the heat in my house here is blowing heated air. And I believe that the process of heating the air also tends to dry it somewhat. So in my house, once the heat starts kicking, the air in the house really does tend to dry out considerably. And that's when I really feel like I've got to protect my bins from excess evaporation and drying, because it does get pretty dry. So, you know, I forgot to use one of these as well, I had 4 of them. I figured we could use one as bedding down in the feeding and then one as a replacement feeding zone indicator. It doesn't matter. We can put it aside and we'll use it in another system another day. This top covering of newspaper can come back sort of the way we found it, but the plastic we're going to put back a little differently, I think. I think the way I'm going to put it back is with the opening, the bag's opening, sort of not in a spot where it can get all damp and inviting for the worms to hang out in or enter into. I think I'm going to kind of leave it open like this so it stays dry, and if they do wander out onto it, they're going to be like, hey, what am I doing out here? It's too dry. Let's get back into the worm bin. And it is going to leave a little bit of the material exposed to the air over there on the edge. But you know, these castings, they have a tendency to really hang on to their moisture, so I'm not worried. If it dries out a little bit around the edge, that's fine. All right, let's get the other system out here. We got another one to feed. All right, I was just kind of seeing if I can get a little sense of whether or not there's worms squirming around within the plastic bag. In this case, I don't think I see any signs of it. And the other one, that edge was sort of down on the material, and then it was even damp over here, sort of making it into an inviting spot for the worms to explore. So I guess I was a little bit more skillful in positioning this top covering last time than I was in the other bin. And here we've got a top covering piece of newspaper, which is definitely showing some signs of wear. I don't even know if we had a feeding zone indicator, but if we did, it's gone. I don't see any sign of it. All right. Sometimes I try to see how many uses I can get out of, oh, maybe this is a piece of coffee filter. Perhaps this was. That probably is what's left of our feeding zone indicator. All this other paper has writing on it, printing, newspaper, but this stuff has no writing on it, so this is probably our feeding zone indicator. We'll replace it, but you know what we'll do is we'll see if we can keep this thing around as the top covering newspaper for one more round. Then maybe next time we'll go ahead and swap out the top covering newspaper in both systems. So these both of these systems being launched on the same day and getting fed at the same time, each, you know, feeding, each check-in, they've been maintained to the best of my ability, at least in an identical fashion. So I believe we're going to find same types of foods as leftovers. Here's another corn cob. Here's a little tiny piece of corn cob. And I think we're also going to find a pumpkin stem in here too. Probably a bunch of leftover bits of cantaloupe rinds. Let's see if we can expedite this second bin's feeding. Sometimes I sort of treat the exploration of bin number 1 when I've got 2 bins to feed as more of the I don't know, evaluation, where I try to size up how the bin's doing and what I should do for it in addition to whatever it is that I already had planned. So in this case, I'm sort of going into it with slightly better expectations, sort of almost knowing what to expect, assuming that things are going to be very similar to what we saw in the other system. So it is pretty much more of the same. The corn cobs we're seeing in here are little tiny chunks of corn cobs. In the beginning of the summer I had chopped up, I figured maybe I would start chopping up corn cobs into these little tiny pieces rather than putting them in more or less whole. And that got old pretty quick. So I kind of stopped doing that. So here we've got the other half of the pumpkin stem. The part that went into the other bin was the part that connects right up to the pumpkin itself, and this is the top of it. It looks like they're making their way down through the pumpkin stem too. It's pretty neat the way they burrow down into it. I guess it is more or less a woody, tough kind of a substance, but it's certainly not as tough as everyday wood. I mean, it's tougher than most foods they get, and it does take a long time for them to break it down. But I don't think it was really all that long ago that I put it in here, so they're really getting to work on it. Alright, let's just sort of keep tilling up the feeding area. If there's good sized chunks of leftover bedding bits or food bits, we can sort of set them aside. I don't know, I guess it sort of gives me a sense of how, how they're doing in terms of eating their food. Here's another pretty large sized piece of cantaloupe rind. Here's another pretty large sized piece of newspaper, holding up pretty good, probably because it was sort of folded over on itself. And I think there's still little bits and pieces of, here's more cantaloupe rind. So yeah, there's more leftovers floating around down in here, but I think we can start opening up this hole so that we can proceed with giving them today's feeding and let them get back to work for us. So far I don't see any real deviation from what we observed in bin number 1. I guess the main deviation would just be the plastic coverings, and the fact that I put the plastic covering onto this system a little bit better than I did in the other system. So we're going to just take care to make sure we don't create a little death trap for the worms when we cover up by putting the plastic covering on in a similar fashion as to how we found it when we first arrived. Alright, I think we've got ourselves a big enough hole here to fit today's feeding. We're going to come back in with about what we gave the other system, which was about two handfuls. I just want to, I don't know, I feel weird reaching into my supply of bedding when I've got little wormies on my fingers. I always feel like I'm going to sort of implant my bedding supply with one or another type of worm, and then that worm's going to get over into my other systems, and then I'm going to cross-contaminate. But in reality, I'm pretty sure that all my bins are probably to a certain degree cross-contaminated in terms of not being pure with the type of worm that I believe is living in each system. It's like, these being African night crawlers, or what I believe to be African night crawlers. Could be just a mix of things, who knows. So yeah, I think that looks to me like about an equal amount of banana peel. I guess once we put the grapes in, we'll get a sense of whether or not these guys are getting more or less. Here again, it seems like a pretty similar quantity of grapes for these guys. I'm curious to see how these grapes are going to hold up. Next time we come in here, these things are probably going to be hardly even touched. Somehow in the past, I've always noticed that grapes take a little while for the worms to get into. But since these are frozen, there's not a whole lot I could do other than just drop them in. But the next time we come in, if we can, we'll kind of squish them and whatever, break them a little bit and see what we could do about helping them to the finish line a little bit rather than just letting them sit and stagnate. Alright, I think in the other bin we dropped in the leftovers first, and then in came the new foods. Here we sort of reversed the order. I'm not trying to be overly strict with my attempt at keeping things consistent. I think close enough is good enough in most cases. So, we're almost done. So I think we'll cover up in the process of examining the outskirts of the bin. That'll give us a pretty good thorough covering of the feeding area. At the same time, we're going to get a glimpse into how things in the outskirts of the bin are holding up. Very much the same as we saw in bin number 1. It's not too hard to keep bins in sync with one another, but when they do start to deviate a little bit, then sometimes it's a useful telltale to let you know that either something's going awry and needs correction, or, you know, on the flip side, maybe you're actually noticing something really working well for whatever reason. And then you see if you could track that down so you could try to replicate it in the other system. Although, you know, just by the nature of what we're doing here, we are more or less attempting to replicate what we're doing in each system with the other system. But sometimes it just doesn't go that way. And any sort of deviations you notice between the bins could be a little clue to let you know that things are different, and that if you really want to keep them in sync, then you might have to make adjustments to what you're doing. Good numbers of worms, lots of castings. These little guys are doing a heck of a job in here. Very nice. Very nice. Okay. I guess we can start thinking about getting that newspaper back out here, draped across the top, to see if we can still make some use out of it as a top covering. It looked pretty tattered when we removed it, I must admit. But before we do that, we've got to bring in one of these coffee filters to indicate to ourselves where we last fed. Not that it would be so difficult to find my way back to the feeding zone, because I pretty much feed in the middle everywhere, all the time. Although on a few occasions recently I did start adopting varied feeding methods. Sometimes I'd be going ping pong, back and forth. Sometimes I would just go corner to corner to corner, alternating the feeding location each time. Currently I'm not really doing that anywhere, if I remember correctly. So finding my way back to the feeding zones usually should be pretty straightforward. So it's more of a tradition, I would say. It's not anything that's there to really help me prevent myself from making a big error. Alright, figured maybe now's the time to start unfolding some of this paper. Give it all a good chance at being accessed by the worms and nibbled away. It does seem like when it's folded over on itself, it seems a little bit more impervious to worm activity. All those portions of the material that's sort of sheltered from the worm traffic by itself. Maybe we can expose more of it to worm traffic and find that more of it's been consumed by the worms next time we come in. Yeah, I got a feeling we're going to have to replace that thing next time we come in here. That seems almost guaranteed. So do we have any worms on our gloves? I don't think so. We did a pretty good job, and even though the stuff is nice and damp and, you know, got a good moisture content, it's not sticking to my gloves too much. It's not sticking to itself, not getting muddy. That's pretty much the type of material I like to see in my systems. Yeah, you might notice that this is the same exact type of plastic bag that we had in the other system, except this one's going right to the edges of the bin. This bin is a little bit smaller than the other bin that we just fed. That's another slight deviation between the two systems, but hardly worth mentioning. Just thinking in case anybody spotted it, noticed it. Did we add? I think we did. I'm always looking for where I screwed up, but sometimes it's just too late and doesn't matter. All right, everyone, that's it. I've got a few things I got to take care of cleaning up and putting away. I'm not going to keep you around for that. That's boring. Before I go there really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. All right, everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.